The scientists placed a camera inside the coffin of a wealthy man for scientific research. But as soon as the images were connected, what appeared before them shocked them, prompting them to immediately call the police. "You know, James, life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you when you least expect it," his father used to say, whiskey glass in hand, eyes fixed on the sprawling empire he had built. James, even as a young man, understood the weight of those words far too well. James had everything a man could want. Born into privilege, his father was a real estate mogul who turned everything he touched into gold. His mother, a revered surgeon, saved countless lives. Their home was a mansion, but their lives weren't picture perfect. Beneath the wealth and success was a family teetering on fractures no money could mend. When James's mother passed away after a long battle with cancer, it left a void no luxury could fill. James was barely 18, too young to fully grasp what he'd lost, but old enough to feel the cracks in his father's resolve. Then came the unexpected, the arrival of a new woman, Catherine's mother. Beautiful and poised, she brought along Catherine, her teenage daughter, into their lives. James had been cautious, keeping his distance from his new family. Trust didn't come easy for him, especially when it felt like this woman was more interested in the family fortune than the family itself. Catherine, on the other hand, seemed harmless. Quiet, polite, always smiling just enough but never too much. Over time, James softened. She's just a kid, he thought. And maybe, just maybe, this new family dynamic wasn't so bad after all. Catherine and her mother gradually earned his trust, not through grand gestures, but with the simple consistency of their presence. When James' father passed suddenly after a short illness, the weight of the family legacy landed squarely on his shoulders. Real estate and artifact collecting weren't just businesses, they were traditions. James took up the mantle, excelling at both, his natural talent and charisma quickly earning him respect. But success came with loneliness. The sprawling house felt emptier with every passing day, each achievement a hollow victory without his parents to share it. Catherine and her mother stayed close, a small but steady comfort. James convinced himself he had made the right decision in letting them in. Yet, there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when Catherine's smile felt too rehearsed, her concern too measured. He brushed it off. Paranoia wasn't becoming of him. 6 months after his father's death, James decided to move back into the family home. The city had changed under his stewardship. Roads were repaired, schools were funded, and hospitals were built. Yet, the house loomed like a ghost, filled with memories he could no longer outrun. He returned, hoping to find solace in the familiar walls of his childhood. The neighbors admired him. A man with his wealth, doing so much for us regular folk? That's rare, they'd say. But admiration quickly turned into shock when the news broke one quiet morning. James was dead. It was Catherine who found him. She arrived at the house to deliver some documents, only to stumble upon James lying motionless on the floor of his study. "James!" she screamed, dropping everything as she rushed to his side. His skin was cold, his chest unmoving. Panic surged through her as she called for an ambulance, though deep down she already knew it was too late. The doctors confirmed her worst fears. "We did everything we could," they said, but the cause of death remained elusive. Catherine, seemingly distraught, clutched at straws. "He had a heart condition," she told them, her voice trembling. "It wasn't serious, but he was on medication. Maybe that's what happened." The medical records she provided seemed to corroborate her story, though no one thought to question their authenticity. When the idea of an autopsy was suggested, Catherine was quick to refuse. James would never have wanted that, she insisted. He always said it violated human dignity. Please, honor his wishes. Her resolve was unshakable, and the hospital staff respected her request. They kept James's body in the morgue while she arranged the funeral, her mind racing with plans. Catherine stayed up all night, restless, searching for a way to ensure her brother's memory was honored while keeping the truth buried, literally and figuratively. Catherine's fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through articles, her eyes scanning for something, anything, that could give her the edge she needed. When the headline caught her eye, she paused, her breath hitching. Pioneering research. Cameras in coffins unveil post-mortem secrets. The article described a team of scientists conducting a year-long study, monitoring bodies after burial to gain new insights into decomposition. For Catherine, it was a lifeline wrapped in justification. James would have loved this, she muttered to herself, as if seeking his posthumous approval. It wasn't entirely a lie. James had always been fascinated by the impact of science on society, but in her heart, she knew it was a convenient excuse, a way to avoid prying eyes while keeping her secrets intact. She reached out to the scientists, her voice carefully calibrated to sound both somber and composed. "I read about your research," she began. "My brother, he passed unexpectedly, and I think this is something he would have supported. He always wanted to make a difference." The lead researcher responded with enthusiasm, explaining the process and assuring her it would honor James's memory. By the end of the call, Catherine had the necessary documents in hand. She signed them without hesitation, though the weight of what she was doing bore down on her like a lead anchor. The day of the funeral arrived, overcast and cold, as though the weather itself mourned James's passing. The church was packed. Neighbors, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances had come to pay their respects. James had touched many lives, and their tear-streaked faces bore testament to the man he had been. Catherine played her part flawlessly. Draped in black, her eyes rimmed with redness, she accepted condolences with a fragile grace that drew whispers of admiration. "She's holding up so well," one mourner murmured to another. If only they knew the thoughts swirling behind her downcast eyes. When it came time to lower the coffin, the scientists discreetly affixed their equipment. The camera, barely noticeable, was nestled into the interior lid, designed to transmit images to their lab at scheduled intervals. Catherine watched from a distance, her lips pressed into a thin line. Every detail was proceeding as planned. As the coffin descended into the ground, she allowed herself a moment of reprieve. Her secret was safe. Or so she thought. At precisely 7 p.m., the first transmission from the coffin began. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit lab, the researchers gathered around a monitor. The room was silent save for the hum of machinery and the occasional shuffle of feet. The screen flickered to life, showing the still interior of James's coffin. The image was pristine, every detail captured in sharp clarity. For several minutes, nothing happened. It was, as expected, a peaceful, undisturbed scene. But then, a movement. It was faint at first, a slight shift as though the body had been jostled. One of the scientists leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could respond, the movement grew more pronounced. James's fingers twitched, then his hand jerked. Gasps erupted around the room as the researchers watched, frozen in disbelief. James's chest heaved, his face contorted in panic. He was alive. James awoke to suffocating darkness, his chest tight and his mind disoriented. For a moment he thought it was a nightmare, a cruel figment of his imagination. But the hard, unyielding wood pressing against his back and sides told him otherwise. He tried to scream, but his throat was parched, and the sound came out as a ragged croak. His hands shot up, frantically pushing against the lid above him. It didn't budge. Panic clawed at him, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the realization set in. He was buried alive. Desperation gave him strength, and he pounded against the lid with all his might. Each thud reverberated through the confined space, a futile cry for help. "No! No!" he rasped, tears streaming down his face. In the lab, chaos erupted. The lead scientist grabbed his phone, dialing emergency services with trembling fingers. "This is an emergency," he stammered. "The subject, he's alive. You need to excavate immediately." The authorities were skeptical at first, but the live footage left no room for doubt. Within minutes, a team was dispatched to the cemetery, sirens wailing as they sped through the night. Back at the gravesite, Catherine sat alone in her brother's house, nursing a glass of wine. She had planned every detail meticulously, ensuring there would be no loose ends. The money from the research compensation was already earmarked for charity, a final flourish to solidify her role as the grieving sister. The sound of sirens pierced to the air, faint at first, but growing louder. Catherine frowned, setting her glass down. "What now?" she muttered, rising to her feet. When the flashing lights illuminated the front yard, her stomach twisted. Nervousness crept up her spine as she opened the door to find a police officer standing on the porch. "Ma'am," he began, his tone serious, "we need to talk." Catherine's mind raced, but she forced a calm smile. "Of course. What's this about?" The officer hesitated. "It's about your brother." The words hit her like a freight train, but she kept her composure. "James?" she said, feigning confusion. "Is something wrong?" Before the officer could answer, her phone buzzed on the table. A notification lit up the screen, a message from the scientists. "Urgent. James is alive. Authorities have been notified." Her blood ran cold. At the cemetery, chaos unfolded under the pale glow of floodlights. A team of officers and scientists worked furiously to unearth James's coffin. Dirt flew as shovels scraped against wood, the urgency of the moment palpable. "Careful!" one of the scientists barked, sweat glistening on his forehead. "We don't know how much oxygen he has left." Moments later, the coffin was pried open. James lay inside, his face pale, his breaths shallow but present. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He was alive, clinging to consciousness with sheer determination. "Get the stretcher!" a paramedic shouted, and within minutes, James was carefully lifted out of the ground. His eyes fluttered open, meeting the stunned faces surrounding him. "You're safe now," a medic reassured him, though James's expression remained distant, his mind clearly grappling with the ordeal. By the time James reached the hospital, news of his miraculous survival had spread. Reporters gathered outside, their voices blending into a chaotic hum as they fought for a glimpse of the man who had been pulled back from the brink of death. Inside, doctors worked swiftly to stabilize him, their whispers betraying their disbelief. As James regained strength, his mind raced. He remembered the darkness, the suffocation, and the overwhelming panic. But more than that, he remembered Catherine, the way she had insisted on skipping the autopsy, her hurried decisions that now seemed far too convenient. When an officer entered his hospital room later that evening, James was ready. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "It's about Catherine." Catherine sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her composure slipping with each passing minute. The officers had been cordial at first, asking routine questions about James's condition and the events leading up to his burial. But as the conversation deepened, their tone grew sharper. "You seemed very adamant about not allowing an autopsy," one officer said, leaning forward. "Why is that?" Catherine crossed her arms, feigning indignation. "James hated the idea of it. He always said it was undignified. I was just respecting his wishes." The officer nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "And the medical records you provided, where exactly did you get those?" Her pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral. "They were in his study. I assumed they were accurate." "Assumed," the officer repeated, his voice flat. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is a signed statement from one of James's colleagues. It says he had no known heart condition. Care to explain that?" For the first time, Catherine's mask cracked. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The silence hung heavy in the room, punctuated only by the faint hum of the overhead light. Meanwhile, James recounted his suspicions to the police. "I knew something was off with her," he began, his voice steadier now. "She was always hovering, asking questions about my work, my collection. A few months ago, I moved everything to a secure location. I didn't tell anyone, not even her." The officer taking notes looked up. "Why didn't you report your concerns earlier?" James sighed, the weight of regret evident in his expression. "I wanted to believe she was family, that she cared about me. Guess I was wrong." Back at the station, the interrogation reached its breaking point. Under mounting pressure, Catherine finally broke down. Her shoulders shook as she buried her face in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. The lead officer leaned closer. "Then tell us how it was supposed to happen." Catherine hesitated, her voice trembling. I needed the artifacts. I thought if I could find them, sell them, everything would be fine. I didn't mean to hurt him." The confession spilled out in fragmented sentences. She admitted to spiking James' coffee with a heavy dose of sleeping pills, thinking it would give her enough time to search the house. But when she returned to his study, she found him unresponsive. "I panicked," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know the pills would... I thought he was dead." "And the records?" the officer pressed. "I forged them," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't let anyone find out. I thought if I made it look like a natural death, no one would question it." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Catherine slumped in her chair, the weight of her actions finally crushing her. James had been clear when he spoke to the authorities. "I knew something was off about her," he'd said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "Catherine was always asking questions about my father's collection, what it was worth, where I kept it. I didn't want to believe she'd do anything reckless, but I wasn't about to take chances." His precautions had been simple but effective. Months before his supposed death, James had moved every piece of his father's prized artifact collection to a secure warehouse, hidden under a different name. It was a decision born from instinct, one he hadn't expected to prove so vital. Acting on James' account, the police obtained a warrant and went to the address he provided. The warehouse stood on the outskirts of town, unremarkable in every way, its anonymity part of its security. Inside, the officers found exactly what James had described: shelves lined with carefully catalogued artifacts, each piece wrapped and preserved with meticulous care. The discovery was undeniable proof of Catherine's motives. Among the collection were several items reported as missing from James's home, pieces that had vanished shortly before his death. The officers documented everything, their case against Catherine growing stronger by the minute. Word of the investigation spread quickly, reaching the local community. People who had once admired Catherine for her apparent devotion to her stepbrother now looked on with disbelief and anger. "She had us all fooled," one neighbor said, shaking his head. "I thought she was grieving. Turns out, she was just waiting for the right moment to strike." The betrayal cut deeply, not just for James, but for everyone who had placed their trust in Catherine. For weeks, the story dominated conversations in the small town. Strangers approached James, offering their sympathy and support. "We're just glad you're okay," they told him. But the words, though well-meaning, did little to ease the bitterness left behind. The trial began with intense media coverage, reporters filling the courtroom as Catherine was led to her seat. Her once polished demeanor was now replaced with visible weariness. The weight of her actions and the public scorn had taken their toll, but she maintained a facade of defiance as the charges were read aloud. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically: the forged medical records, the sleeping pills, and the stolen artifacts. They painted a picture of calculated greed, a woman willing to do whatever it took to seize what wasn't hers. Catherine's defense attempted to argue that her actions were born from desperation, not malice, but the facts were too damning. When James took the stand, the room fell silent. Dressed simply but neatly, he exuded a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with Catherine's frailty. He spoke with measured calm, recounting the months leading up to his burial, his suspicions about Catherine, and his experience in the coffin. "I trusted her," he said, his voice firm. "She wasn't just my stepsister, she was part of my family. I let her into my life, my home, and she repaid me with betrayal. But what hurts the most isn't what she did to me. It's what she did to my parents' legacy. My father's collection wasn't just about wealth. It was about preserving history. She tried to destroy that for her own gain." The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Catherine was sentenced to prison, her attempts to justify her actions dismissed by the judge as hollow excuses. As the sentence was read, Catherine finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she whispered. But the words fell flat in the courtroom. James watched her silently, his expression unreadable. James stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the trial still heavy on his shoulders. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For months, his life had been consumed by betrayal, investigations, and the pursuit of justice. Now, with Catherine sentenced and the ordeal behind him, he faced an unfamiliar silence. Justice, he realized, wasn't the same as closure. The damage Catherine had done couldn't be undone by a verdict, but it was a start. And James knew that if he wanted to truly move forward, he couldn't dwell on what he had lost. Instead, he had to focus on what he could build. The first step was reconnecting with the community. Before everything had gone sideways, James had dedicated much of his time and resources to improving the town. Schools, hospitals, infrastructure. He had poured his heart into projects that lifted others up. Now, he returned to those efforts with renewed purpose. People noticed the change in him. There was still kindness in his eyes, but it was tempered with a quiet resolve. "James, you're incredible," an elderly woman said after he donated funds for a new library wing. "After all you've been through, you're still thinking about others." James gave her a small smile. It's not about me. This town was there for me when I needed it. I'm just paying it forward. His projects grew in scale and ambition: a scholarship program for underprivileged students, a health clinic offering free care to those who couldn't afford it. Everywhere James went, he left something better than he'd found it. And the people in turn rallied around him, offering their support and gratitude. But rebuilding wasn't just about the town. It was about the connections James had let slip away during the chaos of recent months. One evening, he found himself scrolling through old contacts on his phone, names that once meant something to him, but now felt distant. He started with small steps: a text to an old college friend, a call to a former mentor. Slowly, those tentative gestures turned into dinners, coffee meetings, and heartfelt conversations. "I'm sorry I disappeared," James said during one such meeting with a childhood friend, Sam. They sat in a quiet diner, the smell of coffee and bacon lingering in the air. Sam shrugged, a soft grin on his face. "Life happens. What matters is you're here now." The truth was, those relationships grounded him. They reminded him of who he was before Catherine's betrayal had cast a shadow over his life. And in the warmth of those reconnections, James found a flicker of hope. That hope extended to the legacy his father had left behind. For years, his father's collection of artifacts had been a source of pride and fascination, a testament to his love for history and culture. But now, to James, those pieces felt like anchors, weighing him down with memories of greed and betrayal. It was a difficult decision, but one he knew was right. James arranged for the collection to be appraised and sold, ensuring that each artifact would find a home where it could be appreciated and preserved. The proceeds, he decided, would go entirely to charity. When the last piece was packed and shipped, James stood in the empty warehouse and let out a long breath. The space felt lighter, freer. It wasn't just about letting go of the artifacts, it was about releasing the past. His father's legacy wasn't in objects, it was in the values he'd instilled in James. "This is how I honor you," James whispered, his voice steady. "Not by holding on, but by giving back." With the funds from the sale, James launched his most ambitious project yet, a non-profit organization dedicated to education, healthcare, and emergency relief. He named it New Horizons, a nod to the future he was determined to build. New Horizons quickly gained traction. Local businesses partnered with him, offering resources and volunteers. Schools reached out, eager to collaborate on scholarship programs. And James, for the first time in months, felt a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. At the first board meeting, he addressed his team with a quiet confidence. "We're not just here to help," he said. "We're here to give people a chance to dream bigger, to believe in something better. That's what this is about." One night, James woke in a cold sweat, his chest heaving as the remnants of another nightmare clung to him. The darkness, the suffocating weight, the frantic pounding against the coffin's lid. It all came rushing back, as vivid and real as the night he had been buried alive. He sat up in bed, his heart hammering in his chest, and pressed his palms against his face, trying to steady his breathing. The nightmares had been relentless since the trial. No matter how much progress he made during the day, the nights brought him back to that place, trapped, helpless, and betrayed. Determined to reclaim his peace, James sought help. He started therapy, something he'd once considered unnecessary, even indulgent. But the first session revealed how much he had been carrying. The therapist, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a gentle voice, listened without judgment as he recounted the nightmares, the betrayal, and the lingering anger. "It's It's not just what happened, he admitted during one session. It's the fact that I didn't see it coming. She was family. I let her in. The therapist nodded thoughtfully. Trust is a powerful thing, James. Losing it can feel like losing a part of yourself, but trust can be rebuilt. If not with others, then at least with yourself. The sessions didn't erase the pain, but they gave him tools to navigate it. Slowly, he learned to confront the memories instead of letting them control him. He found ways to ground himself when the past threatened to overwhelm him. Breathing exercises, journaling, even simply walking through the community he had helped rebuild. As the weeks turned into months, another question began to gnaw at him. Could he ever forgive Catherine? The thought felt impossible at first. Her betrayal had cut deeper than any wound, and though she was serving her sentence, the emotional scars she'd left on him remained raw. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook, his therapist said during one particularly difficult session. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did. Forgiveness is for you, James, not for her. He wrestled with the idea, turning it over in his mind during quiet moments. Forgiving Catherine felt like betraying himself, but holding on to the anger felt like carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He wasn't sure which was worse. Then the letters started arriving. The first one came 3 months after the trial. It was addressed simply to James, the handwriting familiar, but shakier than he remembered. He stared at it for days before opening it, his emotions a tangled mess of curiosity, anger, and reluctance. When he finally read it, Catherine's words caught him off guard. She didn't try to defend herself or justify her actions. Instead, she apologized. Over and over, she wrote about her regret, her shame, and her hope that one day he might find it in his heart to forgive her. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, one letter read. But I hope you find peace, even if it means never speaking to me again. I'm sorry, James, for everything. The letters kept coming, each one more heartfelt than the last. At first, James ignored them, tossing them into a drawer without a second glance. But eventually, his curiosity won out, and he began to read them carefully. Her remorse seemed genuine, her words raw and unpolished, as though she were bearing her soul on the page. They stirred something in him, questions he couldn't ignore. Was she truly sorry? Could she change? And if she could, did that mean he could let go of the anger that had been weighing him down? One day, James made a decision. He contacted the prison and arranged a visit. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve, but he knew he needed to face Catherine, to look her in the eye and confront the tangle of emotions she had left him with. The day of the visit, he felt a mix of dread and resolve. The prison walls loomed large as he approached, their cold grey exterior mirroring the unease in his heart. After clearing security, he was led to a small, sterile room with a metal table and 2 chairs. He sat down, his hands resting on the table, and waited. When Catherine entered, she looked different, thinner, paler, her once carefully maintained appearance replaced by a worn fragility. She hesitated at the door before stepping inside, her eyes meeting his with a mix of hope and fear. "James," she said softly, her voice trembling. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze steady as he studied her. Finally, he said, "Why?" The single word hung in the air, heavy with years of hurt and betrayal. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I was desperate," she admitted. I thought if I could just take the artifacts, I'd solve everything. I didn't think about what it would cost, not until it was too late." James leaned back, the weight of her words sinking in. You didn't just take things, Catherine. You took trust. You took family. I know, she whispered, her tears spilling over. I ruined everything. I'm so sorry, James. I know I can't fix it, but I needed you to know that. The conversation was tense, painful, and raw. But as they spoke, something shifted in James. He didn't forgive her entirely, not yet, but he felt the anger begin to loosen its grip. By the time he left the prison, he felt lighter, as though a part of the burden he had carried for so long had finally been set down. James found himself reading the newspaper on a quiet morning when an article caught his attention. It detailed a prison rehabilitation program that had been gaining praise for its innovative approach. At its heart was a memoir written by one of the inmates, a personal story about betrayal, regret, and redemption. The author was Catherine. He paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The headline didn't name her directly, but the description left little doubt. She had written about her actions, the pain she caused, and the lessons she learned from her choices. The article mentioned how the book was being used to teach empathy and accountability to at-risk youth, sparking conversations about forgiveness and change. For a moment, James wasn't sure how to feel. There was a strange sense of relief in knowing that Catherine was trying to make amends, even if it couldn't undo the past. Her remorse, it seemed, wasn't just words on paper. She was trying, in her way, to turn her mistakes into something meaningful. He folded the paper and set it aside, the familiar weight in his chest feeling just a little lighter. Months later, James ran into an old friend he hadn't seen in years. Emma had been a constant presence during his college days, always the one with a quick joke or a kind word when things got tough. Their paths had diverged after graduation, but the warmth in her smile when she saw him was the same as ever. "James Reynolds," she said, crossing her arms with a teasing grin. "I'd heard you were saving the world, but I didn't think I'd see it for myself." He chuckled, his usual reserve melting away in her presence. "Hardly saving the world, just doing what I can." Emma became a regular part of his life again, slipping seamlessly into the spaces where loneliness had taken root. She didn't push or pry, content to simply be there. Over time, her easy laughter and quiet support began to feel like more than just friendship. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to hope for something beyond the shadows of his past. As James's personal life flourished, so did his community work. The story of his survival and perseverance had become a source of inspiration for many, sparking a wave of collective goodwill. Neighbors who once only exchanged pleasantries now came together for local causes, organizing charity drives and volunteering for community projects. Businesses donated resources, schools implemented mentorship programs, and even the youngest members of the town pitched in with small acts of kindness. "James showed us that we're stronger when we work together," one resident said during a town hall meeting. "If he can rebuild after everything he's been through, so can we." James, though humbled, rarely took credit. "It's not about me," he'd say. "It's about what we can do for each other." With the success of his nonprofit New Horizons, James began laying plans for expansion. He wanted to bring its mission to underserved areas, ensuring that no one felt forgotten or left behind. His vision was ambitious: mobile clinics for rural communities, scholarships for students in struggling school districts, and partnerships with local leaders to tackle systemic challenges. During a meeting with his board of directors, he outlined his next steps. "We've come so far," he said, his voice steady with determination. "But this is just the beginning. We owe it to those who've supported us, and to those who need us, to keep going." For James, the work wasn't just about helping others. It was about honoring the legacy of his parents, the lessons they had instilled in him, and the second chance he'd been given. And as he poured his energy into new horizons, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Years later, James stood in front of a packed auditorium, the spotlight casting a soft glow across his face. He had been invited to speak at a national conference on community resilience, his journey now a symbol of hope for countless others. As he shared his story, he didn't shy away from the pain and mistakes that had shaped him. "What I've learned," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "is that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about finding meaning in what you've endured. It's about choosing to build, to forgive, and to move forward." The audience gave him a standing ovation, but James didn't linger in the applause. His focus was on the impact his words might have, the lives they might touch. Meanwhile, Catherine's story had taken a quieter turn. After years of good behavior and active participation in rehabilitation programs, she was granted early release. She chose to live a simple, unassuming life, dedicating her time to volunteer work and mentoring others who had lost their way. Though James and Catherine occasionally exchanged letters, their contact remained minimal. Both seemed to understand that forgiveness didn't necessarily mean closeness. For Catherine, the distance was a reminder of what she had lost. For James, it was a boundary that allowed him to heal fully. In time, James found a new kind of happiness. He and Emma married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends and family who had supported them through everything. Their home became a haven of warmth and love, a place where laughter echoed in the halls, and the lessons of the past were gently woven into the fabric of their lives. As a father, James approached parenthood with the same compassion and resilience that had guided his own journey. He taught his children the value of kindness, perseverance, and the strength to admit when they were wrong. Together, they built a life that stood as a testament to hope and renewal. The story of James is a deeply moving journey of resilience, forgiveness, and the transformative power of hope. His path from betrayal and despair to renewal and purpose is not only inspiring but profoundly human. What makes James's journey so impactful is his ability to confront unimaginable pain, being buried alive, betrayed by family, and grappling with the scars left behind, and turn it into something meaningful. The most striking element of his character is his quiet strength. James doesn't succumb to bitterness. Instead, he chooses to rebuild his life by helping others. His decision to forgive Catherine, though difficult, reflects the profound truth that forgiveness is more about freeing oneself than absolving others. It's a testament to the power of letting go to find peace. The story also highlights the importance of community and connection. James's work with New Horizons and his reconnection with loved ones demonstrate how shared support and kindness can heal even the deepest wounds. Ultimately, James's journey teaches us that while we cannot change the past, we can shape the future with courage, compassion, and purpose. It's a story that reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.